Hello everybody, welcome back. Welcome back to another week or another session of photography training. We're going to get started in a couple of seconds. I see there's still people joining. But welcome so long. And today we're talking about vintage lenses. So get your questions ready about using vintage lenses. Yeah, anything related to those. Like previous sessions, I will be answering questions as we go. So in the YouTube chat, just pop your questions. I'll keep a lookout for any questions coming in as we go. So yeah, you're welcome to ask your questions in the YouTube chat. Great, we are going to get started in a couple of seconds. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. I hope everybody is keeping warm. Been a couple of chilly days. Good. Let's start with some of the admin before we get going with the presentation on vintage lenses. So first off, if you're not a member of the Joburg Photowalkers meetup group, definitely a good idea to join if you stay in Joburg. If you live in Joburg or close to Johannesburg, always good to join Joburg Photowalkers. The photo walks are organized through the Meetup app or the Meetup website. You can use either one. And I am posting the link in the chat to the Meetup group for Joburg Photowalkers. Definitely worth joining. There we go. The link to the Meetup group is in the chat. Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. I see there's more people joining. Welcome. Thank you for joining. We're going to get started just now. Yeah, so the link I just posted is for Joburg Photowalkers meetup. Like I said, definitely worth joining. And then I'm going to post one more link. It is for the MailChimp list. This little mailing list is a mailing list just to send out the link for the weekly training. So on the day of the training, I send out an email with a link to the YouTube Live. And you can just click the link to join the training. So I'm posting the link there. You can subscribe to the mailing list and you'll get a weekly reminder for the training. Good. We've also got a WhatsApp group. If anybody wants to join, just let me know. There's a WhatsApp group specifically for this training. So if you've got any photography related questions, technical questions, editing questions, gear related questions, you can ask it in that WhatsApp group. So just let me know if anybody wants to join. I can add you on that WhatsApp group as well. Good. Today we're talking about vintage lenses. It's a topic I love. It's something I use a lot professionally and for myself. So we'll have a look at how those work. Good. I think we can just about get started with the training for today. Yeah, that's looking good. We're looking good on time. Like I said, if you've got any questions, just pop it in the chat. We will handle those as we go. You're welcome to ask your questions. So let's get started. Vintage lenses, what are they? Why would you use them? Are they any good? How would you use them on modern cameras? Do they actually work on modern digital cameras? These are all good questions. So vintage lenses generally are older lenses, maybe like this one, probably 40 something years old. This specific lens model was made in the 70s mostly. So I guess this version I've got is probably from the 70s. They were usually made, well, they were made in those days to go on film cameras, so normal film cameras that you would shoot 35mm film with. The most common ones were used on 35mm film cameras, but you also got medium format and other lenses as well. We'll mostly be covering 35mm format lenses because they're the most common, and they're also the most useful to pair up with modern digital cameras as well. Okay, so why would we actually go for vintage lenses? Why would we be interested in them? Well, firstly, there's a couple of ways of seeing it. So obviously technology advances and things like lenses and lens coatings and things become more advanced. We get things like autofocus in more modern digital cameras that work with modern lenses. The old film cameras were manual focus. And so there's a couple of things we need to keep in mind, but there are many benefits of actually using vintage lenses even today in 2022 or going forward. Like I said, I love vintage lenses, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first thing is, when I use modern digital cameras like these ones, this is a mirrorless camera. The one thing that a lot of the new lenses do, or the new cameras do, is if you put a modern digital lens on with autofocus and all the nice things that we have, as soon as I switch off this camera, the lens resets. When I switch it on again, the focus is moved. So some of the settings in the lens actually moves every time you switch the camera on and off. The nice thing, especially for street photography, and that's one of the places where I use manual focus lenses a lot, is whatever settings I put, aperture and focus settings I dial into this lens, I can put this lens onto a digital camera and I can switch the camera on and off, and my focus distance is not going to change. So whatever I focused on, whatever distance I focused on, whatever settings I set on that lens, I can switch the camera off, I can walk around. When I switch it on again, I press the button, it's still focused to the exact same spot. And in street photography, that's very often a very useful thing to do. Okay, so that's the one benefit. It doesn't reset every time you switch it off because there's no electronics in these lenses. Okay. The next thing is, these lenses usually came with they were either kit lenses or bought separately to put onto old film cameras. And so if you've got an old film camera, if you used to shoot film, or if you still do, like I like still shooting film every once in a while, you might have one of these lenses already sitting on a camera on the shelf or on the bookshelf like me. Okay, so you might have good lenses lying around that you aren't using, that you could be using with your modern camera as well. Okay, so that's another benefit of vintage lenses. The other thing is fast focus, and we'll see why. There's a couple of tricks that you can do only with manual lenses that you can't do with a lot of the modern digital lenses, and you'll actually get faster focus than using autofocus on a digital camera, and I'll show you why. There's a couple of situations where it's actually faster using a manual lens. Okay, we'll talk about those. Then the look of the photos you get. So even if you put a vintage lens on a modern digital camera, we'll see how we do that just now, we lose some of that like crisp, sharp digital look in a lot of cases, depending on the actual lens we put on. So a lot of these vintage lenses weren't perfect. Some of them are amazing and they can hold up to the image quality of modern lenses, modern digital lenses, but some of them weren't perfect. The coatings weren't perfect. Some of them were like a little bit cheaper lenses. And what actually happens is it gives you a specific look. And even on a digital camera, you get a little bit of that film look. These lenses, depending on the coatings as well and which lens you go for, they could change the colors, they could change the contrast, you could get some lens flaring, and all these things might, depending on what you like, it could enhance the photo you get. So there's a built-in look. You don't have to edit for that look. With some of these lenses, they're actually really beautiful, and that sort of analog feel that they give your images could actually be really beautiful. For instance, I like the look of a lot of these vintage lenses, specifically the way they render color, the way they handle contrast, and also the way they flare when you're taking photos into the sun, for instance. Those lens flares to me is really beautiful, and a lot of the modern digital lenses have got specific coatings to actually stop those flares. So you can't get really beautiful lens flares with a lot of the modern lenses, even if you try. And the vintage lenses, a lot of them will give you beautiful lens flare. And you can do it on purpose. Okay. So the look of it, that's another nice thing. The next benefit is the price. So firstly, you might have some vintage lenses lying around already. They might be on cameras on the shelf, old cameras, and you could just adapt them to your new modern camera. So price could be free. You might have them lying around. Then also you could find them on second-hand marketplaces and things, usually on a camera. Most of my vintage lenses I actually bought on a camera. So I sometimes buy a film camera just to get the lens. It happens. And old film cameras you can get for pretty cheap, depending on what models you're going for. So these vintage lenses could be super cheap, and especially compared to modern lenses, very cheap. Okay? The next thing, the size of these lenses. So this is a 28mm lens. You can see the size there. It's tiny. Modern prime lenses tend to be generally for the same sort of same application, same specs. They tend to be about twice the size, mostly because they've got autofocus motors and all sorts of electronics in there. Sometimes they also have more complicated lenses, and yeah, so the optics in there might be a bit more complicated as well on some of the later lenses or newer lenses. So the size is definitely a big benefit. These vintage lenses tend to be tiny. Okay. Another benefit, shooting JPEGs. So I love shooting JPEGs. I've returned to shooting more JPEGs and dialing in specific looks I want in camera. And these vintage lenses actually help me to do even more in camera so that there's less editing afterwards. I like the look of a lot of these lenses. So you can actually select the lens that you buy based on the look you're going for. And then, yeah, less editing. That's always nice. Okay. So we've looked at some of the benefits. What's some of the drawbacks? So the one thing that could be a benefit and a drawback is obviously it's manual focus. There's no autofocus. So the autofocus that your camera would normally be able to do, modern digital cameras, eye tracking and all these things, not going to work. Okay, so you lose your autofocus capabilities. But manual focus can also be really good. It could be really nice. We'll talk about when manual focus is actually an advantage. One of those I can mention right now is manual focus in low light situations. So I do a lot of events, and very often at events, maybe on dance floors or inside venues, places like that, you'd be photographing in pretty low light. And manual focus is actually easier to get your focus spot on in low light. A lot of cameras, even like really modern digital cameras, they very often struggle in low light to lock on with their focus. They've got amazing focus modes, but a lot of the time they don't work in very low light. One other thing is, I've compared doing manual focus on vintage lenses like these to using the same camera or digital camera with the modern lens on and autofocusing, and especially in tricky conditions. So if there's, like at an event, if there's layers of people and I want to focus on one specific person, with the digital camera, if it gets the focus first time, it's faster than manual focusing. So I can't focus as fast as the autofocus works on my digital camera. I'm a little bit slower, and I've been doing manual focus for many years. But the difference is, if my digital camera misses the focus, if it picks the wrong face, if it picks the wrong person, if it locks onto the wrong spot, if it can't find the person that I actually want to photograph, then trying to reset that, trying to leave the button, press it again, try and force the camera to focus on the person that I wanted to focus on, takes longer once it's missed focus than what it takes me to do manual focus. So worst case scenario, dialing in manual focus is going to be faster than using a digital camera if it misses. So if you have to refocus with a digital camera, getting it to actually reset and get another face takes longer than just adjusting your manual focus. Because in manual focus, if you miss your focus slightly, it's just a slight adjustment to get it back where you want it. Okay. So there's definitely conditions where manual focusing is actually a benefit and not a drawback. But some people could see manual focusing as a drawback. That's one of those. Then one other thing, the one other thing is some of the vintage lenses could be considered soft. So comparing to modern digital cameras and lenses, some of these old lenses, they were designed for film, shooting film, and they aren't as crisp sharp as some of the modern lenses. And I'm generalizing a little bit here because you get some of these lenses, and I've got some of them, like there's specifically a couple of Olympus lenses and some other brands as well, like Nikon and Canon, that had amazingly sharp prime vintage lenses in their day. And they can still hold up to anything you can buy today. Leica has got some lenses that are still super sharp compared to anything you can buy today. Some Zeiss lenses, some Olympus lenses, like I said, Nikon, Canon as well. But it was specific lenses that were super sharp. And then some of the other ones, even in the same range, were known to be soft. So you don't get that high quality, high definition. But if you're looking for something crisp, sharp, some of the vintage lenses might not do the job for you. So that's another drawback. Okay, let's keep going. The coatings, the lens coatings, that could be a drawback. So there are a couple of vintage lenses that actually had radioactive coatings, which people tend to stay away from. They don't like that. They don't like the idea of that. So I don't have any of those lenses. I also try to stay away from them. But if it bothers you, just make sure you don't get one of those. So that's the one thing. But the other thing is also some of the really good advances in lens technology it wasn't so much on the actual lenses or the glass that's in there. It was on the autofocus side and then the coatings. So the coatings have changed a lot over the years. So the new modern lenses will have lens coatings on the lenses themselves, and those coatings will stop things like flaring, losing contrast when you're shooting into light. So there's a couple of things that these coatings will actually do. Some of the really old vintage lenses would have no coatings. Some would have like very old style of coatings. Some would have decent coatings, like these Olympus. The later Olympus lenses would have quite nice coatings, but not as good as a modern digital lens. So that's another reason that you might prefer a modern lens versus a vintage lens. I see it as an advantage because the older coatings get really nice lens flares shooting into the sun, which I actually like. So, okay, next up, which vintage lenses should you look at? So, over many years of trying different vintage lenses, buying things secondhand, using all the old lenses that I already had from when I still exclusively shot with film cameras, I've tried a lot of different lenses, and my own rule is I would generally go for prime lenses. The old vintage zoom lenses weren't as good. They're generally quite soft. I also don't like the way they handle. A lot of them have got like a push-pull action and a twist action all in one. For me, that's not ideal. And like I said, a lot of the old zoom lenses were just softer than the primes. So if you're looking for a really good vintage lens, I would say go for a prime. And the two focal lengths that, like through the, let's say around about the 70s is a good time to buy lenses manufactured in the 70s are generally good lenses. So you could go for Nikon lenses, you could go for Leica lenses, you could go for Canon lenses. Pentax made some amazing lenses, as well as Olympus. Personally, I used Olympus film cameras like the IM1 for many years. I started with Olympus film camera, so I just had a lot of Olympus lenses, so I tend to collect more of them. But whatever brand you prefer, whether it's Canon or Nikon, whatever it is, Pentax, don't forget Pentax, they made amazing lenses. Okay, so go for primes. And in the 70s, the two really popular focal lengths would have been 28 millimeters and 50 mils. You also got some longer ones up to maybe 100 and something millimeter lenses, all primes. So those are the ones I would focus on. Go for a prime lens. Go for something that would have been popular in those days. They would have been well designed. You will find that the 50 millimeter primes are very common. You would very often find them, if you buy an old film camera, you would find a 50 mil on there. They were sort of the standard that everybody had a 50 millimeter prime. Generally, the cheaper ones are about f1.8, which is great. If you spend a bit more, you could get an f1.4. And those lenses are generally some of the best vintage lenses to buy. Okay. Next question. We've got a question in the chat. Can you put digital lenses to manual focus and don't always have to use autofocus? Yes. You can put whatever digital lens you put it on your digital camera. You can switch either on your camera or on the lens. You can switch it to manual focus. The only issue with that is on the old vintage lenses, your manual focus throw. So from one end, if I go from infinity to the closest it can focus, this lens can do 0.45 meters. So from one to the other side is a pretty short twist, and the lens moves mechanically when I do this. Okay. On new modern digital lenses, if you switch it to manual, it's still electronically controlled. So your focus ring that you're turning generally spins all the way around. You have to do a couple of revolutions to get it from one end to the other end. And you spin the lens electronically, it tells the motors to move, and then the motors move. So you're not really connected to what you're doing. It's not as accurate, doesn't feel as good. And also you don't get all the markings for the meters or feet so that you can pre-dial in your manual focus. So there's a couple of drawbacks. I've tried using digital lenses in manual mode, but I just, with those, generally tend to switch back to autofocus because it's a bit clunky. They don't work as well. They're not designed to be used manually. Generally, the way they work, the way the focus ring works is just not ideal. There are a couple of lenses out there. I know Olympus made a couple of digital lenses that still have the mechanical ring, and you still get markings on the actual lens for distances, which actually helps, and you can basically switch it over to manual. But most digital lenses don't have that, and the focus ring is something that just spins and it's electronically connected, not mechanically. Okay, so how do we use these lenses on digital cameras? That's where these things come in. They're called adapter rings. So you can get them very cheaply, very, very cheaply. So the first nice thing with vintage lenses is the lenses are very cheap. You pick them up on second-hand apps and places, very cheap. And then these adapter rings are even cheaper than the vintage lenses. So what this does is you get different mountings on the one side for modern cameras, and on the other side you get the old vintage mountings. So there's big ranges that you can look at and just go, whatever digital camera you've got, match that up with the vintage lens you're interested in, and you get the adapter ring. So all this does is it goes onto, let me show you. So this is a very nice Olympus 50mm f1.8 in this case. So all I do is I take my adapter ring, I put it on the lens. Let me just line it up. Here we go. So my adapter ring is now connected to the lens, and then I can take my very modern digital camera, mirrorless camera in this case, and it goes straight on. So now I've got a vintage lens on a modern mirrorless camera. You might notice I've got another one set up back here. Where is it? Back here. We'll play around with that just now. I'll show you my camera feed, the video. Okay, but that's as easy as it is. There's no electronic connection from the lens to the camera, so the camera does not know what the lens is doing. But with modern cameras, that's not an issue at all. It's metering through the lens, so you can still get all your automatic exposure modes. The only thing you will do by yourself is focus. Also, obviously, you'll set the aperture on the lens, but that you'll generally set and leave it for specific conditions, and you'll just be doing the focusing. The exposure, the camera can still do because it's metering through the lens. Okay. Let's see, have we got more questions? What tricks do I have to focus quickly? I'm going to show you all of them. So I've got these tricks dialed in. I can focus super quickly with the lens. The one thing I have to say is you need to practice, and it's going to take you probably about 3 months to really get fast with focus. But once you get it, it's a skill and a technique that will be really good going forward, I think. Very useful skill. I love manual focusing. Okay. And just as background, I'm a professional photographer. I do professional photo shoots, and very often I do events, corporate headshots, product shoots, and I would be using vintage lenses like this just because I like the look, and for specific applications, I think it saves me editing as well. And yeah, I like the vintage primes, a specific few of them, much more than any digital lens. So I would do, last weekend I did an event and delivered, I think, about 700 photos. They were all shot on vintage lens. It was during an event, so I had to be able to quickly focus. There were kids running around, and so it's definitely possible to use vintage lenses professionally. Okay, we'll have a look at some images as well just now. Modern lenses are focused by wire. Yes, they are. That's the issue. So even if you switch a modern lens to manual, the focus by wire, actually it feels like a disconnect. You can't focus as fast. You can't read distances on the actual ring of the focus ring. You can do with vintage lens. Okay. What else? I think that covers the questions for now. If you've got any questions, just pop them in there and we'll cover those. You asked about a trick for fast manual focusing. Here's my first one. We'll talk about more as soon as we go over to my camera and I show you my camera feed on the. But the first one that you can remember, if you've got a nice vintage lens, especially something like a 50mm, every time you drop your camera, say if it's on if you're doing an event or you're walking around and you've got it on a strap or something and you're going to drop your camera to just hang on the strap, what I do, and it's just a habit now, it took me a while to get into the habit, but as I go to drop my camera, I twist my focus ring to get it to infinity. Okay, so it's a very short twist from infinity to most places on the ring. So up to, from infinity is where I am now, and you'll see it's a short twist to there's 1 meter. So just that twist is from infinity, like the mountains and the moon and whatever in the back, all the way to 1 meter from my camera. It's a twist that goes from there to there. Just that. That twist on this lens is all the way from infinity to 1 meter. So why do I go to infinity every time I drop my camera? Because when I pick it up and I need to focus, it's against the stop and it can only go one way. So if I leave it somewhere in the middle, I pick my camera up and something's not in focus, I don't initially know which way to twist to get it in focus. Whereas if I leave it when I drop it in at infinity, it's always going the one way. So I just start twisting it until it's in focus and it's done. So that's the first tip. Always when you drop your camera, go back to infinity, except in conditions where you're doing maybe street photography and you're zone focusing or pre-focusing, or maybe you're doing an event and somebody's doing a talk on the stage and you focused on that distance, then you can drop and leave it there because you can pick it up and press the button, still focused in the same spot. So that's the nice thing with the manual focus lens. Once you're pre-focused, you can just drop and press the button. But if you're walking around and the focus distance is going to be changing the whole time, if you're doing like an event and the one person is close and the next shot is a longer shot, then a good thing to do is just always drop it back to infinity, because as you pick the camera up, it's just one twist one way and you're back to focus. Okay, so we will continue. Cool. We'll see you later. No worries. The replays are available, so enjoy your evening. If you have to go, it's all good. I'll make the replay available for everybody as well. Okay, cool. Let's keep going. So which vintage lenses? That's what we were talking about. I would say something like a 50 if you haven't got something, if you're looking at something like a vintage 50mm, either f1.8 if you want to save a bit of money, the amazing lenses. If you want to spend a little bit more, f1.4. Okay. Generally, a lot of the vintage lenses, what you'll also find is if it's an f1.4 lens, f1.4 might not be super sharp. A lot of the vintage lenses wide open were a little bit soft. But as soon as you do one click the other way, so you go to f1.8 on an f1.4, then it becomes perfectly sharp. Okay, on an f1.8 lens, you go to f2.8 and it's perfectly sharp. So on some of these vintage lenses, you might not want to be all the way open, just do one click the other way and they become really sharp. Okay, something like f5.6 generally on the vintage lenses are the sharpest f-stop you'll get. Okay, what else? Let's keep going. Let's keep going. There's also, and that's the other thing, when these cameras, these sort of film cameras were popular, they obviously were full frame because it's film, 35mm film. Very wide lenses weren't popular. So if you're looking for something very wide, there's some modern manual focus lenses that are amazing. So there's companies still making manual focus lenses that are amazing, and they are very similar to these vintage lenses. And especially if you're looking for something wide angle, they might be worth looking at. They're a lot cheaper than digital lenses. You can still adapt them. You can do all these things. So the top end companies who still produce manual focus lenses, amazing lenses, would be companies like Zeiss, Voigtlander, and Leica. All three of these companies produce amazing lenses at higher prices, obviously, but generally, if you compare spec for spec, they'll be cheaper than autofocus lenses. Then going to like mid-level, if you're looking at vintage lenses, older lenses, then you could look at Nikon, Canon, Olympus, and Pentax. And then companies that produce manual focus lenses right now that look like vintage lenses. So the lens designs are very similar, the coatings are very similar, they are mechanical, no electronics, and they're very cheap. You can look at companies like Laowa or Venus, Seven Artisans, TT Artisan, Rokinon or Samyang, that's the same company, or Pergia. I think if you're looking at wide angles, a company like TT Artisan, it's super cheap lenses and they're amazing. They look like vintage lenses, physically look like vintage lenses, and also the results look like vintage. And you get all the benefits of full focus, no electronics, things that I like. Okay. Those are just a couple of things to keep in mind if you start looking at. But also, you're welcome to ask me if you've got, you're thinking about a lens or specific application. I've done a lot of shooting with manual lenses. I know a lot of them, so I'm happy to answer any questions that come up. Okay, yeah, so for sharpness, just stop down 1 or 2 f-stops and you'll be good. Close down the aperture a tiny bit if you want super sharp images. I like the look even wide open, even if it's a tiny bit softer. That look is sometimes something I go for, especially in portraits. It's quite flattering. But if you want super sharp on a lot of these vintage lenses, just stop down 1 or 2 clicks. Okay. Good. Let's hop over to my Lightroom and we'll have a look at a couple of things here. So that's what we're busy with. This is a portrait from a recent event that I did, event photography. I delivered, I think, over 1,000 images over the course of a full day of shooting, and minimal editing, because these JPEGs straight out of camera with a vintage lens, beautiful. The look these vintage lenses will give is amazing. So even the bokeh out of focus areas, the vintage lenses very often have a very specific look to the bokeh. I like it. I like the out of focus areas with vintage lenses. This is a 50mm f1.4, probably at about f.8, and I absolutely love the way these lenses handle color. I like the way they handle contrast, and there's a definite look that you get already in this is out of camera JPEG, no edit, and I love it. So it saves me a lot of money using vintage lenses. Well, not only in buying the lenses, but in editing. This was an Olympus OM 50mm f1.4. But quite a few of the manufacturers that made like were larger manufacturers in the 70s would have a very similar lens to this. I know there's also a Pentax that looks almost exactly like this Olympus. I'm sure you would find a Nikon and a Canon that also gives you a very similar look. All 4 of those manufacturers, I'm sure, has a very similar. The Olympus 50mm f1.8 also looks almost exactly like this. Tiny differences, but it's a very similar lens. They use the same formula. Even the lenses look similar if you compare them side by side. Okay, so and also compared to modern digital lenses, no issue with sharpness and detail. Not overly sharp, so, but there's plenty of sharpness. Not like a toy lens or something. These lenses were professional lenses. They're really good. I love using them. If you nail the focus, they'll be sharp. Most people who complain with vintage lenses about lenses not being sharp actually miss focus. So that's the trick. You can get your focus, you'll be good. Next, product photography. This image was taken with the this lens. So this vintage lens, another Olympus. And like I said, I've got Olympus lenses because I started my photography with Olympus cameras, and I've got old Olympus film cameras, and I had a lot of Olympus lenses. I've meanwhile bought more of those, but it doesn't need to be Olympus. There's plenty of really good vintage and modern manual focus lenses you can buy brand new now that will do really good job. So this is yeah, like I said, product photography, no issue. It looks crisp and clean. You wouldn't say it's a manual focus lens, and this is a JPEG straight out of camera. Next, another one, another JPEG straight out of camera. Crisp, clean, no issues, blown out background like I wanted. Vintage lens. You wouldn't say that it's a vintage lens, but 40-year-old lens on modern camera. There you go. The details there, everything is there. The colors are amazing. The contrast is amazing. And this is straight out of camera JPEGs, no editing. So, yeah, I love it. I've got a question. Do you focus on the eyes when doing manual focus for portraits? Absolutely, I do. Yeah. If I've got time, if it's a portrait and I've got a bit of time, I definitely manual focus straight on the eye like I would do with autofocus. My focus is eye if I've got time. Cool. Now we'll talk about autofocusing and how can you always get focus? So there's a couple of tricks. Okay, one of them is we're going to hop into Photowalkers right now, and I'll show you one trick that a lot of street photographers use. I use it as well at events sometimes, especially when I'm walking around and also doing street photography. So it's called zone focusing. Let me open up Photowalkers here for you. There we go. So we're in Photowalkers, and just to illustrate what zone focusing is I'm going to go depth of field. We're in the little depth of field tool inside of Photowalkers, and we're going to have a quick look at a couple of these things in here. So let's say I go for a 50mm lens. There we go. I've got let's go for a Fuji camera. So I've got a Fuji camera. I've got a 50mm focal length lens on there. So that would give me in 35mm terms a 76.7 equivalent. So that's a nice portrait lens. Maybe we go for something wider. Let's say we go for something that's 23mm. So that gives us a 35mm equivalent. So that's a very popular street photography sort of lens. So the real millimeters on the lens would be a 23 or 24, thereabouts. Gives you about a 35mm equivalent in full frame. The Fujifilm is a crop sensor, so you have to do that conversion. If you put it on a full frame camera, you don't have to obviously convert. But let's say that's the lens we're using. We're shooting it at f8. Happy for that. We're outside. It's sunny. We're walking around doing street photography. And we are focusing, let's say, 3 meters away. Okay. What's happening here? If you look at this little diagram in the middle bottom, it actually tells me if I focus 3 meters away, I pre-focus, I set my focus on my lens for 3 meters, f8 on this 23mm lens, then everything from 1.41 meters, you'll see there at the little face in the middle, I can't zoom it in though, but it says The closest that's in focus is 1.41 meters, and the furthest thing that's going to be in focus is at 22.39 meters. So anything between about 1.5 meters to 22 meters is going to be in focus at this setting. A nice wide angle. So I set it at 3 meters. I walk around the whole day, and when something happens, when somebody passes me, when somebody interesting walks around, when there's a scene I like, I pick up my camera and I press the button. Done. Anything from 1.5 meters up to 22 meters is going to be crisp, sharp, in focus. No issues. So that's really interesting. That's what we call zone focusing. So we preset a zone based on our settings. Generally, we're shooting apertures like f8, maybe anything from f5.6 to f11, just to open up that depth of field. So we've got a lot in focus. We pre-focus and then we forget about it. We walk around, pick up the camera and press the button. That's faster than trying to autofocus on somebody's face, moving autofocus points. I just pick up the camera and I press the button, it's done. At events, doing street photography, you never have to focus if you do zone focusing, and you know that you just have to step back or forward to control that zone. So if somebody is too close, you take a step back, get them back to that 1.5 meters. Somebody generally won't be further than 22 meters if you're taking a photo of them. Fine there. But that's what zone focusing is. So you set a zone, you know what the zone is, you know what's the closest thing and the furthest thing. And because you've got these markings on the lens, I'll show you a close-up picture just now. You can actually set it to 3 meters and forget about it, walk around, press the button, done. So that's zone focusing. And then the next concept is, when it comes to manual lenses, you can also do something that's called hyperfocal distance focusing. So with any lens, if you close down your aperture like to something like an f8 or f5.6, you get such a wide depth of field. So there's so much in focus that the furthest one you can move to infinity, which means the mountains, the moon, the buildings, anything far away is in focus. So that's where the 1 point ends of your focus. And then it actually gets quite close to you. This case, with these settings, you can see that the little picture on the right hand side in the screen there, there's a little infinity sign where the tree is. So that means everything up to infinity, distance of infinity, focus. And the near point of focus is 1.7 meters. So everything from 1.7 meters to infinity is going to be in focus. If I pre-focus to a distance and it tells me my hyperfocal distance is 3.4 meters. So all I have to do is set my focus at 3.4 meters, and then I won't have to focus on anything between 1.7 meters and infinity. All crisp, sharp focus, no issues. So that's another way. It's faster than autofocus on any camera, is just using zone focus or hyperfocal focus. Okay. Now, the only thing you won't get is you're not shooting wide open, so you're not getting blurry backgrounds for portraits. But generally, when you're doing a portrait, you've got a bit more time. So you open up your aperture, and then you actually just have to dial in your focus on somebody's eye, take the portrait, and you can go back to zone focusing for quick reactions. Okay. So hyperfocal distance and zone focusing, two very, very good things to do with focus lenses to get everything crisp, sharp. Okay. Let's head back to my Lightroom, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples there. So there we go. That's one of these lenses, just a close-up of the focus ring. So you'll see some things on this focus ring. Right here in the middle is where I'm focused, where this red line is. So right now, this lens is focused on, let's say, 0.6 meters. The 0.7 is just to the right. So we're about at 0.65 maybe. We're just under 0.7. Let's put it that way. So 700 millimeters away from the camera. That's where we're focusing. This lens up here, you can see it is set to 16 f16. At f16 on this bottom scale, you'll see a 16 here and you'll see a 16 on this side. What does this mean? The furthest point in focus right now is 1 meter away. The closest is 0.5 meter away. Okay, so at this f16 lens setting where I've focused now, everything from 0.5 meter to 1 meter will be in crisp, sharp focus. And this is the nice thing with manual focus lenses. You've got these scales that tell you where you're focusing. And then it also tells you how much will actually be in focus in front and back of that focus point. Okay. Let's move on to hyperfocal distance. So what have I done on this lens? I've actually gone and set it at f16 here just to illustrate. It's easier to see because it's the widest markings, but you could use f8, f3.5, whatever you want. But right now it's set at f16. You can see it here at the top. Okay, what are we getting in focus? I've twisted my manual focus ring to align this infinity sign with the line of the 16. See the infinity sign here and the line of the 16. So that means I've put infinity as my furthest point that everything is in focus. And how close do we get? On the other side, we're getting just over 0.7, so let's call it 0.8. So everything at f16 from 0.8 of a meter up to infinity is going to be in focus. Okay. As you open up your aperture, those lines actually get closer. So that's f8, f8, f3.5, f3.5. If you're really shooting wide open, you have to be accurate. Okay. But using hyperfocal distance means I don't have to even focus. Okay. And this is something you only get on manual focus lenses. You won't find this on modern digital lenses. Okay. So that's another little trick to quickly focus. Now, very quickly, I'm going to show you a couple of things that's very useful when it comes to yeah. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that's very useful when it comes to modern digital cameras, especially cameras like mirrorless cameras. They've got a few features that will help us focus very quickly. So I'm going to switch over my view to my camera behind me, and hold on 1 second. I'm going to just walk to this camera. I'm going to talk you through my settings, how I set up my camera, how do I manual focus. We've got a couple of objects here on the table. I've got my camera there, and I'm going to show you my camera view and talk you through my settings to perfectly focus. Okay. So let's go here. Give me a second to switch my camera on. There we go. Okay, so everybody can see my camera. What do we have here? Let me show you. We've got one old Contax vintage camera over here. We've got an Olympus Trip 35 over here. This was actually the first camera I ever took a photo with. I was about 5 years old. This is the actual camera I used. It used to belong to my mother. Beautiful camera, still works. I still use it. And I've got an old vintage microphone in the back here. So as I open up my aperture, this lens can go to f1.4. You will see that the stuff way in the back is now out of focus. Okay, and just pop any questions into the chat if you've got questions. Now I'm twisting my focus. Now the back is in focus and the front is out of focus. And so the very first thing we can do with modern cameras is we can just look through the viewfinder and we can actually try and focus correctly. Now, this is a really tough way of getting your focus correct because you can't really see the fine details through the viewfinder, even on the screen on the back. It's very hard to accurately focus and know that I'm accurately focused. Okay, so what are our options? Well, the first option is we just look at the screen and we try to focus it. That's not very accurate. Our second option that works for both DSLRs and with mirrorless cameras is we can use the screen on the back. Mirrorless cameras, you can use the viewfinder or the screen because they're both screens. But on a DSLR, you switch on your live view. And in modern DSLRs, you have a button where you can zoom in. On my mirrorless camera, I can do the same. So I can click a button and it gives me a zoomed in view. Okay, so we can look at the detail there and we can adjust our focus until we are in focus. So on the live view on your DSLR, you'll be able to do this as well. Okay, on a DSLR, some of them, depending on what camera it is, your autofocus sensors might still work, and it might give you a little scale on the side and tell you to adjust to the one side or the other side. So it will actually tell you when you're in focus. It will show you a little thingy in the middle, or it will show you go left or right on your focus ring, and you will be able to get your focus correct. Some DSLRs will also have a little light in the viewfinder that lights up as soon as whatever your focus point is pointed at is actually in focus. So the camera can still tell when it's in focus and when it's not in focus on a lot of the DSLRs, but it won't be able to actually turn the lens for you to actually get it there. You need to be turning the lens. Okay. Now, moving over to mirrorless cameras, we've got a few more options. This is why I love shooting with mirrorless cameras. Pretty much any modern mirrorless camera will have these features, and they are amazing for shooting vintage lenses with. So first off, with mirrorless cameras, we can punch in. Now, the nice thing is we can also do this while looking through the viewfinder, which DSLRs can't do. You have to switch to live view on the back to do this. Okay. Now, the next thing we can do, not all mirrorless cameras can do this, but this specific one has got a mode that they call digital split image. And you'll see at the top there, the microphone, the bottom part of the microphone is sort of split, so it's got a line through it. And all I need to do is adjust that line until it meets up. So a lot of the old film cameras work this way with the prisms and aligning the focus. I don't generally like this. I don't think it's very accurate. So even if your camera doesn't have this mode, don't worry about it. You're not missing out on much. Now we're getting to the mode that I use most often. It's called focus peaking. You can see the little blue dots flashing there on that Olympus strip. And as I move focus, you'll see the blue dots on the microphone at the back. And as I move focus the other way, you'll see the blue dots on the camera, the Contax camera in the front. Okay. Focus peaking is something you switch on in the settings of your mirrorless camera. You can change the color. You can make it red, white, yellow, green. There's usually quite a few options. Some people prefer red. Depending on what you're taking photos of, sometimes the blue is easier to see. I can also still zoom in. So you can see I'm zoomed in. And as I get focus on this camera, everything turns blue. So all the high contrast areas that are in focus are actually turning blue. And it's telling me that the focus is absolutely perfect right there. This is how I would do a portrait. I would zoom in on somebody's eye and I would adjust my focus until I get the focus peak right there inside their eye. Okay. Once I get that blue or red or whatever it's set at, I know I'm good and I can take the photo. Okay. And you can see as I twist my focus ring, right now everything is out of focus. And as I move through the scene, you'll see this blue first on the one camera, then on the other camera, and then on the back. Okay. So that's a really good way of doing focus. And I'm at f1.4 just to show you that I can also see my depth of field with focus peaking. I'm going to move this blue at f1.4 to the middle camera. So you can see, we can confirm. I will also just punch in there. So you can see right there, this camera is nice and crisp and in focus right in the middle. The front camera and the microphone in the back is not in focus, but as I change my aperture, stop down a bit, you'll see that we start to get blue both on the front camera and on the microphone and the middle camera. So now I've got all three in focus because I've closed down on my aperture. So my focus peaking will also tell me how much is in focus. So even if I focus on one person's face, as I change my aperture, focus peaking will tell me if the person behind them or in front of them is also in focus or not. So if I'm taking group photos, this is really helpful as well. So focus peaking is a really good way of getting your focus correct. And then using that with the punch in, absolutely amazing. There's no reason to miss focus if you've got focus peaking. So I'm just going to, as another last example, go to the back there. Go zoom in there. Now as I focus on it, you'll see the focus peaking come in. Beautiful, crisp, in focus, and I can take my photo. Okay, I hope that helps. That's my absolute favorite way of using manual focus lenses. There's a couple of modern DSLRs also that will give you focus peaking on the back screen. Not all of them can do that. It's more the DSLRs that are actually also geared towards video that will give you focus peaking, because the guys who shoot video very often use this. Let me switch my camera back on. So focus peaking is absolutely one of the best things that you find in modern cameras that will help you every time get focus with vintage or manual focus lens. So yeah, for me, the benefits of using not only vintage lenses, but overall manual focus lenses are far outweigh, for me, the benefits of just using digital lenses. There's obviously times for a good and applications for a good digital lens. If you're doing something like wildlife or sport, it's tricky with a manual lens, that I can tell you. That's generally when I take our modern autofocus lenses. But doing things like street photography, doing things like product photography, events, portraits, I really like using manual lenses. And the cameras are, the new modern cameras are actually really good at pairing up with manual focus lenses. So yeah, firstly, the focus peaking, that's my favorite thing. And then also, as I change aperture, if I do something like use auto ISO, I can open up or close down the lens, and my exposure will still stay fixed, whatever I've set it at with exposure compensation. So I'm not worried when I open up or close that now I'm going to get different exposures. My camera will just compensate. As I adjust the lens, the camera looks through the lens, it sees it getting darker or brighter, and it adjusts the ISO, and I'm still good to go. So modern cameras, really good with old focus lenses. Have we got any questions? Let me have a look. Oh, focus on the, oh yeah, no, we've answered. So I'm going to give it a couple of seconds for any questions. Any specific questions about vintage lenses or any manual focus lens settings? Any questions on how I work when I'm doing photo shoots with these lenses? Let me know. One other thing, very often when you're doing something like, let's say, corporate headshots or portraits as well, or studio work, you have to also keep in mind that you can't work as fast as you want because your lights are recycling. So if you're working in a studio where you've set up some lights in a venue, you're doing portraits or whatever you're doing, if you're working with strobes, the strobe flashes and it has to recharge before you can fire off the next picture. And that time in between is plenty of time to change focus or move around and move your focus. So I don't find that manual lenses in most cases slow me down at all. There's no difference really. I'm working with lenses. Digital lenses, like I said, the only two exceptions might be wildlife and sport. There, I think I'm definitely faster with cool. Doesn't look like there's any further questions. Just the last thing, being able to manually focus a lens and use the things like zone focusing and hyperfocal distances. I think it's a skill, and it's something that takes a bit of time to get to know. But once you do, I think it's a very useful skill. I've been at events where, for instance, pretty dark inside a venue or something, where I've swapped to a manual focus lens. I'm getting more photos in focus than what my camera digital lens can. Okay, let's see. There's a question coming in. Oh no, especially the hyperfocal distance. Yes, absolutely. Hyperfocal distance is really cool. I love using it, especially for something like landscape. It's super useful. Then you know everything into the distance up to a certain point is focus. And with landscapes, generally you want a lot in focus. So, and with these lenses, it's amazing. You choose your aperture, which would generally be a pretty small one if it's a landscape shot. So between, well, f8, f11, f16, whatever it is. So let's say I pick f11, then I look at the scale, I just align my infinity sign with the line on the one side that corresponds to my aperture. And then on the other side, on the lens, I can read off how close my focus would be, 3 meters or 2 meters or whatever for those settings. So that's the one nice thing with these old lenses. You can actually read it off the lens. You don't have to use photo pills or something. Very handy. When they made these things, the engineers really thought about what they were doing. And another thing is these old lenses actually feel nice. The way they work, the clicks. I don't know if you can hear this. It's like it's proper clicky. Just the way they feel, the way the focus turns, the twist, the everything on it feels nice. Feels very different to some of the modern or plasticky. The feeling, the experience is also nice using. I think the results are well, so I can't complain. Great. No, it's a pleasure. I'm glad you picked up something. I think we're going to call it then. There's no more questions. Going to call it, and then yeah, anybody, you welcome to contact me if you've got any questions, if you want any tips on gear or settings. I'm always happy to answer those for you. Right, everybody, keep warm. Have a great evening. That's where we're going to end this off. Thank you. Cheers. Have a good evening.